My name is John, and today's episode shall start from the video game crash of 1983 to the rise of 3D video games. So what exactly is the crash of 1983? The crash of 1983, also known as the Atari shock in Japan, was a massive economic recession of the video game industry that occurred from 1983 to 1985. This crash was a very serious and hard time for the then booming industry that it ended the second generation of video games. This hard time had put a lot of companies on bankruptcy and disarray that produce home computers and video game consoles in the region, including the fastest US growing company in history at that point, Atari. Reasons, causes, and long-term effects of the crash. There were various reasons for the crash, but the main cause, however, was a saturation of the market. The full effects of the gaming industry would not be felt until 2 years later. If it wasn't for the success of the NES, then we would not have all these awesome video games that we all loved and still do up until this day. There were various factors of the crash, such as the flooded console market. At the time of the North American crash, there were many consoles on the market, including the Atari 2600, the 5200, ColecoVision, Magnavox Odyssey 2, and Fairchild 2. In addition to this, Mattel and Coleco created devices that allowed them to play 2600 games on their consoles, and the creation of the Atari 2600 in television clones, such as the Coleco Gemini and the Sears Telegame systems, in parentheticals, private label versions of the Atari 2600 and Intellivision, Tandyvision, in parentheticals, and Intellivision clone for Radio Shack. Each of the consoles had its own library of games produced by the console maker, and many had large libraries of games produced by third-party developers. In 1982, analysts noticed trends of saturation, mentioning that the amount of new software coming in will only allow a few big hits, that retailers had too much floor space for systems, along with price drops for home computers could result in an industry shakeup. The release of so many new games in 1982 flooded the market. Most stores had insufficient space to carry new games and consoles. As stores tried to return the surplus games to the new publishers, the publishers had neither new products nor cash to issue refunds to the retailers. Many publishers, including games by Apollo and US Games, quickly folded. Unable to return the unsold games to defunct publishers, stores marked down the titles and placed them in discount bins and sale tables. Recently released games, which initially sold for $35, were in bins for $5. By June of 1983, the market for the more expensive games had shrunk dramatically and was replaced by a new market of rush-to-market low-budget games. A massive industry shakeout resulted. Magnavox abandoned the video game business entirely. Imagic withdrew its IPO the day before its stock was to go public. The company later collapsed. As a result, while some stores sold new games and machines, most retailers stopped selling video game consoles or reduced their stock significantly, reserving floor or shelf space for other products. This was the most formidable barrier that confronted Nintendo as it tried to market its Famicom system in the United States. Retailer opposition to video games was directly responsible for causing Nintendo to brand its product an entertainment system rather than a console. Using terms such as Control Deck and Game Pack, as well as producing a toy robot called Rob, to convince toy retailers to allow it in their stores. The sales of home video games had dropped considerably during this period, from $3 billion in 1982 to as low as $100 million in 1985. Despite Atari's claim of 1 million sales of its 2600 game system during that year, recovery was slow. Following the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, Atari 7800, Sega Master System in 1986, the industry began recovering with annual sales exceeding by $2.3 billion by 1988, with 70% of the market dominated by Nintendo. In 1986, then Nintendo president, the late Hiroshi Yamauchi, noted that Atari collapsed because they gave too much freedom to third-party developers and the market was swamped with rubbish games. In response, Nintendo limited the number of titles that third-party developers could release for their system each year, and promoted its seal of quality, which allowed to be used on games and peripherals by publishers that met Nintendo's quality standards. The end of the crash allowed Commodore to raise the price of the Commodore 64 for the first time upon the June 1986 introduction of a console called Commodore 64C. A Commodore 64 redesigned for lower cost of manufacture, which the magazine Compute cited as the end of the home computer price war, one of the primary causes of the crash. This crash had long-term effects, however, such as the dominance in the home console market was shifted from the USA to Japan. By 1986, 3 years after its introduction, 6.5 million Japanese homes, 90% of the population owned a family computer, and the company began exporting it to the US. The family computer in the US was known as a Nintendo Entertainment System, which was by far the most dominant home console by the late 1980s. A second highly visible result of the crash was the institution of measures to control third-party development of software. Using secrecy to combat industrial espionage had failed to stop rival companies from reverse engineering the Mattel and Atari systems and hiring away their trained game programmers. While Mattel and Coleco implemented lockout measures to control third-party development, the Atari 2600 was completely unprotected, and once information on its hardware became available, little prevented anyone from making games for it. The ColecoVision BIOS checked for a copyright string on a power-up. Nintendo thus instituted a strict licensing policy for the NES that included equipping the cartridge and console with lockout chips, which were region-specific and had to match in order for a game to work. In addition to preventing the use of unlicensed games, it also was designed to combat piracy, rarely a problem in the United States or Europe, but rampant in Asia, East Asia. Nintendo reserved a large part of NES game revenue for itself by limiting most third-party publishers only to 5 games per year on its systems. Some companies tried to get around this by creating additional company labels like Konami's Ultra Games label, in parentheticals. It also required all cartridges to be manufactured by Nintendo and to be paid for in full before they were manufactured. Cartridges could not be returned to Nintendo, so publishers assumed all the risk. As a result, some publishers lost more money due to distress sales of remaining inventory at the end of the NES era than they ever earned in profits from sales of games. Nintendo portrayed these measures as intended to protect the public against poor quality games and place a golden seal of approval on all licensed games released for the system. These strict licensing measures backfired somewhat after Nintendo was accused of trust behavior. In the longer run, however, many third-party publishers such as Electronic Arts actively supported competing consoles such as the Sega Genesis. Most of the Nintendo platform control measures were adopted by later console manufacturers such as Sega, Sony, and Microsoft, although not as stringently. The rise of Nintendo and Sega to the home console market put an end to the economic recession of the gaming industry in the 1980s. Very popular games of the NES and Sega Master System are Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, Metroid, Mega Man, Metal Gear, Castlevania, Megami Tensei, Alex Kidd in Miracle World, Phantasy Star, Ninja Gaiden, and Bomberman. The 8-bit era. What exactly is a bit? A bit is a single binary digit, a 1 or a 0. There are 2 different places in computing where bits get counted: in color displays and in processing. Each pixel on your screen is assigned a number, which is translated into a color for display. The number of bits tells you how many colors can simultaneously be displayed on the screen. For example, 8-bit color means that you can only have a maximum of 256 colors on your display. Modern systems use 24-bit color, 8 bits, each for red, blue, and green intensities, for a total of 16.78 million colors. In computer processing, numbers are handled not in individual bits, but in bundles of 8 called bytes. The most common processor out there stores numerical values in blocks of 4 bytes each, 32 bits. For integers, that means values from 0 to about 4 billion, or the range 2 billion to plus 2 billion. More recent and more powerful processors store and manipulate numbers in blocks of 8 bytes each, or 64 bits. The 8-bit or third generation started when the video game Crash of '83, ended in a time where video games suffered an economic recession as explained earlier. When Nintendo found success in Donkey Kong, the company wanted into the console business. Unfortunately, at the time, it could not due to the backlash against video games. This led them to disguise the console as a toy using a peripheral called the Famicom Robot, also known as ROB. Also known as ROB for Robotic Operating Buddy. Although not well received, it was something that led to the creation of the family computer in Japan, and in America called the Nintendo Entertainment System when it arrived. Once that was done, they released Super Mario Bros. 1, re-establishing video games as an acceptable form of entertainment. Soon afterward, a few other companies entered the video game console market with its newfound prominence, like Sega with the Sega Master System, and Atari with the Atari 7800, though none achieved the worldwide prominence of the NES. This era introduced a revolutionary aspect of game design, the scroll. Throughout the golden age of video games, games either only had a single screen or flip screen gameplay, which created respectively a constraint in the size of a level and a disruption in the flow of a game. Scrolling graphics was a big leap in game design, in that levels could now be much longer and flow a lot better in the golden age. Also, compared to the golden age, sprites started to actually look like real objects, or at least cartoon objects. More colorful sprites were much more prevalent than the usual monochrome sprites in older games. Also, the backgrounds got much more colorful, whereas golden age games would usually have black backgrounds with little to no detail. Near the end of the 8-bit era, instead of most of the plot being described in the manual, games began adding explaining the plot in the game. They already did this somewhat at the beginning, but it was often just a simple dialogue. Then you were off on your adventure. Basic narrative devices such as chase scenes and different endings were starting to take root in the industry. However, because of the limited hardware at the time, full cinematics couldn't be taken advantage of just yet. Many of the most commercially successful video game franchises of all time debuted as part of this era, with recognizable names like Mario, The Legend of Zelda, Final Fantasy, and Mega Man among them. The 16-bit era. After the success of the 8-bit era, the fourth generation of video games began in 1987 with the release of NEC's TurboGrafx 16. With this new era came hardware more powerful than their 8-bit counterparts, capable of handling more colorful and detailed graphics, as well as more complex types of games. However, the era of the 16 bits gained momentum with the release of the Sega Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis. This console was released to compete with Nintendo's 8 bits, and the console turned out to be a huge success, with games such as Altered Beast. But then, it really took off with games such as Sonic the Hedgehog, which was a major success. And so, that lovable hedgehog became Sega's official mascot. Much like Mario, Sonic was not only in video games, but it also spawned color books, toys, comics, cartoons, such as The Adventures of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic Underground, and Sonic Boom. Sonic also spawned an animated movie as well as an anime in the early 2000s titled Sonic X. With the Genesis being more successful than the NES, this prompted Nintendo to create the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. This fierce console war between Sega Genesis and the SNES defined the era, and both parties were in a huge race for dominance over the industry. The most successful games of the 16-bit era are many of them, not just in Sega, but also on the Super NES. Examples of these successful gems were The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Echo the Dolphin, Yoshi's Island, Super Mario World, and many more. The releases of Mortal Kombat 1 and Donkey Kong Country sparked a craze in digitized sprites on consoles, with notable games following suit including Vector Man and Super Mario RPG. The era also produced early experiments with polygonal graphics on home consoles, most notably Star Fox, but also including arcade ports. Another genre that was born and even more revolutionized in this era was a fighting genre, and the most popular titles of the 16-bit era are fighting games such as Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Killer Instinct. In the next generation, there will be other fighter games that will be rendered in 3D, such as Tekken, Virtua Fighter, and Bloody Roar. The video game Mortal Kombat, however, was very controversial due to blood violence, which shocked and concerned many parents, activists, religious groups, and causing the government to threaten the gaming industry. This led to the birth of the ESRB in 1994. The ESRB stands for Entertainment Software Rating Board, which, much like the Motion Picture Association of America, would include ratings in video games. E. Games rated E stands for everyone, and it was originally called kids to adults. EC, early childhood, is about video games where children ages 3 and up can play, and there is nothing that can disturb parents in the rating of these games, because early childhood games are usually preschool themed in nature. E10. Everyone 10 and Up was introduced in 2005. May contain some violence, language, crude humor, but not with the same extent as the teen rating. T stands for teen, which are video games for teenagers 13 and up. These games contain some mild violence, mild language, suggestive themes, and mild lyrics depending on the song. M stands for mature, for people 17 and up. Games of this rating have strong violence, gore, sexual content, strong languages, and partial nudity. And AO, like NC-17, it's adults only, a rating that is not suitable for people under 18. Much like the M rating, the level of violence, sexual content, languages, and nudity is much more extreme. An example is a hot coffee mod in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. In the third generation of video games, JRPGs were becoming even more popular in 16 bits, but in this generation, the examples of these very popular RPGs are Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy V, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Breath of Fire, Illusion of Gaia, Phantasy Star 2, Super Mario RPG, and many more. The successes of these RPGs would later become a major part in the evolution of consoles and graphics. An example of the company that creates RPGs is Square. Square is very, very popular for creating RPGs. It was called Square before, then Squaresoft, and now it's called Square Enix. Also in this generation, portable gaming systems began to gain traction with the release of the Nintendo Game Boy and Atari Lynx in 1989, and the Sega Game Gear in 1990. While the Lynx failed to gain much success, Nintendo and Sega's efforts gave gamers versions of their favorite franchises to take with them when they were away from their televisions. While Sega's system certainly benefited from its colored screen, it was ultimately the Game Boy that would win out by a considerable margin, boosted by the inclusion of Tetris as a pack-in game, making the system more appealing to those who weren't already interested in video games than Super Mario Land might. Though the fact that it was significantly cheaper, more pocketable, and had much better battery life also helped. Its success will continue into the next generation. One might say this generation ended when the Super NES officially discontinued in 2000, in parentheticals having lasted a few years longer in Japan than America and elsewhere. But the Mega Drive officially discontinued in 1998 and has had an active life. Licensed games by third-party developers has been sporadically released into new tens, and licensed Mega Drive units with built-in games are still being sold today. The arrival of 3D. The fifth generation of video games arrived sometime in 1993 and lasted until 2001. In this era, 16 bits would evolve to 32-bit and then to 64 bits. However, this era ushered in the arrival of 3D rendered graphics in video games, a great leap in terms of graphics, visuals, music, storytelling, design, and also the way that video games were being played and viewed. An early example is Star Fox for the Super NES. It was one of the many first attempts to bring 3D polygons to consoles, and it achieved massive popularity. But when the fighting revolutionary game, Virtua Fighter, was released in the arcades, polygons really took off. This edition made 8 and 16-bit graphic games look outdated and a thing of the past. And it was said that 3D rendered polygons were the future of video games. Nintendo, and its new rival at the time, Sony, were starting to create consoles that can support 3D rendering. These consoles were the Nintendo 64 and the Sony PlayStation. Sega, however, took a while to develop a console that can support 3D graphics. Thus, the Sega Saturn was born. Many gamers who grew up with 8-bit and 16-bit were wowed at the look of 3D rendered graphics, showing more explored worlds in 3D, which had superior depths than the 2D graphics at the time. A lot of the developers worked their heart and time into making the worlds more beautiful and detailed and explorable as well. Great examples of games in 3D at the time are Super Mario 64, Final Fantasy VII, Resident Evil, Metal Gear Solid, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, Star Wars: Shadows of the Empire, Star Fox 64, Rogue Squadron, Chrono Cross, and many more. While Nintendo 64 was still in cartridges, the rest of other consoles went into CD-ROM because it was an ideal format for game developers at the time. And not only that, it was really cheap to produce and had higher capacities than cartridges. An example is Final Fantasy VII, which was originally headed for the Nintendo 64, but due to the lower capacity of the cartridge and the length of the game's storyline and side quests, Final Fantasy VII went to the PlayStation, and so would its successors from then on. While PlayStation and Sega Saturn had CD-ROM formats, Nintendo refused to have one. Why? Because with its earliest experiment, the Famicom Disk System, these CD-ROMs were a target of piracy, and then Nintendo was very, very strict with its games and prevention of piracy. Despite not having CD-ROM format due to lack of third-party associates, the Nintendo 64 is remembered by having analog stick because most of its 3D games had no capacity to use the D-pad. Years later, PlayStation surpassed the Nintendo 64 by introducing the DualShock controller, which had 2 joysticks. And it also had the capacity to vibrate. And speaking of vibrations, the cool thing about the N64 controller was the rumble feature with a special pack known as the Rumble Pack. Many games with rumble features were Star Fox, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, and many more. In the late 1990s, Sega would introduce the Dreamcast, which was far more successful than the Saturn and Sega CD. Many gamers were wild to see Sonic the Hedgehog rendered in 3D, and the rich atmosphere of the hit video game, Sonic Adventure. As for the portables, Nintendo introduced in the late 90s a new version of the Game Boy called the Game Boy Color, which games, rather than their black and white or greenish screen appearances, it was much more colorful and detailed, which was really good. The game that was extremely popular, rivaling Mario for the Game Boy Color, was none other than Pokemon Red and Blue. In 1999, Pokemon Yellow Special Pikachu Edition was released, and then Gold, Silver, and Crystal in the early 2000s. SNK's Neo Geo Pocket and Bandai's WonderSwan would only find small audiences in the markets they reached, and do little to dent the fortunes of Monochrome Machine. This generation is what gave the biggest forward leap in video game history, in both graphics and stories, from sprites to polygons. Conclusion. A lot of people who grew up with the 3rd, 4th, and 5th generation of video games believe that time to be a golden age for video games. Nintendo, Sony, and Sega were really at their best when they introduced 3D. Many games rendered in 3D such as Final Fantasy VII, Super Mario 64, Metal Gear Solid, Sonic Adventure, Resident Evil were so successful, and even good old Castlevania jumped into 3D with Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness. Don't miss the next episode of Video Games in the World, which is the third and final part of the three-part pilot episode. Episode 3, The Birth of Video Games, Part 3, Online Gaming and the Future. I am John, your host. Play hard and have a good one, gamers.